Hey, welcome back to the Ready State. It's part 2 of improving your spinal mental model. Before we talked about sort of the relationship between lumbar and what's going on with the hips, well, the same thing is true for the upper body. These are really analogous structures. So it's really difficult for me to talk about your cervical spine without talking about, you guessed it, your shoulders. And ultimately, we have always said that, in our spine first or nervous system first model here at the Ready State, that we believe that the trunk is really a big chassis for these primary engines. I mean, of course, the trunk is the first engine, but the primary movers are the hips and the shoulders. And so that if I'm dysfunctional or have sort of loss of really good orientation, I may not be able to derive as much force and stability through the primary engine. But there's a key concept here called reciprocating stability, which means that not only do I try to get the trunk into the best position possible for the most function, but the principles that drive rotation and stability and the movements that we do also cause a lot of stability at the trunk. And so that's a really fancy way of saying that, hey, I can't really understand how your neck is functioning and why your brain has suddenly perceived this as a threat unless I also look at the relationship between your shoulders and what's going on in the system. The old physical therapists used to say, hey, you need to clear the neck if you have a shoulder problem, which meant push on the neck, make sure that the neck isn't part of the generation of symptoms or sequela that may be contributing to your shoulder pain. And likewise, they would say, hey, if you're having a neck problem, push on the shoulder. But we want to go a step further, and it's not necessarily about clearing the neck, or clearing the shoulder, it's about appreciating that if I, for example, am missing internal rotation of my shoulders are going to compensate into a position where I see some rounding of the upper back, and this ends up being a position where we see a lot of dysfunction, right? It doesn't necessarily cause dysfunction, but we see a lot of positions where people have dysfunction in this position. Now, the issue is, it may not ever cause pain, but it's certainly going to be a performance loss. And unless I address this internal rotation, I'm never going to get to the bottom of why I may have some cervical positional loss of rotation or function or capacity, right? I can't even breathe in this position. But when we start to appreciate and see the shoulder as deriving stability through the trunk, which also sets up the length-tension relationships and the fascial connections and the rotator cuff function, suddenly we can begin to parse out what looks like some very difficult conversations around the cervical spine by improving the relationship of the shoulder and cervical spine and thoracic spine. So you'll notice that there are sort of these trifectas. We talked about the femur and the pelvis and lumbar. Well, this analogous structure is that I have the thoracic spine, shoulder, and cervical spine. So the key here, then, and the implications of this is that sometimes we hear through the grapevine that people have a little bit of neck ache or neck soreness when they're working at the computers, right? And one of the reasons that could be is that maybe we're not moving, and maybe we're super stressed, and maybe we don't feel safe, and maybe you didn't sleep last night and you're highly inflamed, or maybe we need some input into the system. And one of the actionable ways that we can begin to untangle some of this is actually to do some simple movement or simple work through the shoulders when we're trying to improve the cervical spine. And I don't mean necessarily we need to be under heavy loads, but we cannot neglect the fact that if someone is presenting or is complaining about their neck being stiff or having pain in the neck region, whatever the structures are, that we need some input in the shoulder. There was a good research article, and I can't remember, but I saw it, I think it was out of Australia, looking at workers and neck pain. And it turned out stretching your neck at the desk maybe didn't do a lot to improve neck pain. But you know what did a lot? A lot was neck exercises. And let me show you what the neck exercises were. Lateral raises, arm pulls, push aparts, right? Things that look like shoulder exercises. So it turns out if we can do things that suddenly get the shoulder more involved in the system, we start to see a better relationship between arm and body, which does what? Makes the relationship between head and neck and body a little bit more robust. it's disingenuous for us to appreciate that the neck is deriving 100% of its stability off of the thoracic spine and by the deep intrinsics. We are much more complicated humans than that. It is not just about doing neck turns or rotations or neck tucks. Come on. We have to go back to function. Now, I appreciate that, dysfunction and pain syndromes can be very complicated, but as we begin to try to untangle some of these things, let's appreciate the functional relationships between these parts. And it's not even about being strong. And sometimes it's just about input. So here's the idea. Your neck doesn't ever exist in isolation, and that improving your thoracic spine improves the relationships of your cervical spine, improving how your shoulder functions, and returning your shoulder to its normative ranges, and then doing isometrics or holds or downward dogs or side planks or triangle pose or pull aparts or presses, whatever it is. Input is the name of the game. And when we see better input through the periphery, we see better relationships at the trunk. Hopefully that helps.